Oh bloody hell, he's back at it again. I didn't think you were doing YouTube anymore. Yes, your ninth favourite tech YouTuber is unfortunately back again, but don't worry, it'll be just as much a 2012 experience as ever. No fancy graphs or proper benchmarks, no short form videos or quick editing style for people with an attention span of less than 25 seconds. There'll be no mention of AI, just my disapproving British accent and some knackered old computers. So which knackered old computer is it this time, I hear you ask? Well, before we get to that, let's wind the clock back to February 2017, where I acquired a Dell Vostro 200 office PC and spent 70 quid on it to make a basic gaming PC. It was crap. It only supported 32-bit Windows, had a mechanical hard drive, and a not particularly inspiring GPU. Today, however, I find myself in a very similar situation. I've been given this free office PC, so I've set myself a budget of £100 to make it into something a little bit better. Why was it free, I hear you ask? Well, perhaps it's got something to do with the fact that despite being 9 years newer, it's actually less powerful than the machine I acquired in 2017. Doesn't have a power adapter, because yes, it doesn't even have a power supply, and its mechanical hard drive is about as fast as a wind turbine in a vacuum. Plugging my old laptop charger into it, we find its whopping 6-watt TDP Intel Celeron is brought to its knees with a single browser tab. As for graphics, don't bother, and its 4GB of RAM aren't taking you very far these days. It's literally a netbook screwed into a case, so it's got to go. That case, however, is a somewhat standard micro ATX case. It takes a standard micro ATX motherboard, has 4 expansion slots, normal front panel headers, and a non-standard but still quite readily available power supply, so we can certainly do something with this. We'll start, of course, with the I/O shield, which is inserted from the inside. Preferably not all the way through. This Asus B85M-E micro ATX board is a significant step up and allows us the ability to run Haswell CPUs. Into this we will be fitting an i5-4590S. Topping this is an Intel standard stock cooler, because cheap. Getting our new i5, lining the notches up with the socket and the arrow in the corner, just drop it in there and close the door down, or the bracket, whatever you want to call it. So I no longer have pre-applied thermal paste as I cocked up the last take. So popping some Arctic MX4 in its place, we'll get our new pushpin heatsink, drop it on there. Wiggle around. We can now plug in our CPU fan. This is the only header at the top of the motherboard. To this we will add 16GB of Corsair Vengeance RAM, which is DDR3 1600. When you're dealing with 10-year-old CPUs at their lowest value, you've got to shop smart. Firstly, this smaller case means cooling needs to be considered, as does the power requirement for our power supply. I deemed it wise to limit this build to a 65-watt TDP chip. The S suffix on Intel CPUs denotes a mid-power chip, with T being low power and no suffix or a K variant being the highest TDP in the range. The reason I say this is because in this case a top-end i3, for example, is actually more expensive than a restricted TDP i5 like the one we've gone for here, and lower performance. As we can see, this case has pre-made standoffs and all of them seem to correspond with the motherboard we've chosen here. So all we've got to do is lift it with the new installed heatsink and pop it into the case. Very much like that. So I think now is as good a time as any to install a new power supply. This OEM 80 Plus bronze power supply is from a higher spec version of the same tower, thus fits in the gap perfectly and should provide us with enough grunt to power a small graphics card. It's actually manufactured by Akbel, so it should be fairly decent quality and capable of actually providing the 180 watts it says it will without exploding. This particular model, being one without a dedicated power supply, has just got a blanking plate over where it would install. But thankfully we can very easily just remove these 3 screws and have access. So grabbing our power supply, which I definitely haven't modified in any way, shape or form, going to line it up with the hole. Quite a tight fit, but it is the OEM model from this case, so should fit. There we go. It's not quite an ATX Flex power supply. It's also not TFX, it's somewhere in the middle. It is important to note, however, it would likely be possible to fit a Flex ATX power supply in a gap like this, which are available in higher wattages. You'd have to be a bit creative with the mounting. Further reinforcing the fact this is in fact a standard ATX case, all of the HP OEM leads will in fact fit straight onto a standard motherboard. Starting with the HD audio, you have a standard, an almost standard USB header with card reader, so I'm not sure if that's going to work, but we'll find out in due course. Very much the same with this one. And finally, a standard front panel power switch and LED. We'll get our 24 pin motherboard connection. Pops in like so. And at the top, of course, we've got our 4-pin CPU power, which is just about going to fit round the RAM there. Pop our 2 last motherboard screws in before I forget, because obviously we do now have a larger board. As for drives, the original 1TB WD Blue will make a good storage drive, but for a boot drive on modern Windows we really need an SSD. So this Intel 1500 series 180GB will just about take care of that. We also already have a DVD drive and all of its associated cabling, so I may as well keep it. So I'll plug its power lead in there, and its data connection in there. Seeing as it's only a DVD drive, we'll plug this into one of the slower 3GB per second ports. Like so. So the power supply actually includes a lead for the micro DVD drive, as it's from a larger model of the same chassis. As for our other drives, as I mentioned earlier, I have slightly modified it to have an additional power socket for the hard drive, which was already present, but also now another smaller one just to run our SSD, which are very low power anyway. But I do not recommend modifying your power supply in any way, shape or form, of course. Both of our storage drives then will be plugged into the SATA 6GB connections on the motherboard. As you can see, it's getting a little bit tight in here now. And as is a standard staple measure for me, I will mount this absolutely nowhere. I'll just throw it in that corner and it'll be quite safe there. If we actually want to push at least a few pixels with this thing, then we're going to need a dedicated graphics card. This is always the most difficult part of these builds, as we need something low power and low profile that actually has a bit of grunt. In this case, I selected a little bit of an oddball card, the AMD E9173. This was originally an OEM only part, should be within our power supply's limits as well as those of our budget, while significantly outperforming our previous system. No external PCI power is required, so it's a simple job to just slot it in. Well, I suppose now would be a good time to see if it actually works or not. There we go, we have our i5 4590S at 3 GHz, all 16 gigs of RAM, and all the drives look to be detected. And there is our BIOS. Well, it doesn't look like a terrible botch, so let's see what we've got here. The bare desktop was free, from which we only really used the case and the storage drive. Our motherboard was £27, the RAM 15, the power supply just £6.49, the heatsink was £7, the CPU was £8.99, the SSD was £9, and the GPU was £24.94, leaving us at a total of £98.42. Can it actually do anything though? Let's find out with some benchmarks that have not been relevant for at least the last 10 years. Starting with some less demanding titles, both at 1080p high settings with 4x anti-aliasing. Firstly, an older game, the classic Just Cause 2 Dark Tower benchmark brings in an average 41 FPS. Minecraft on default render distance scores a healthy 90 or so. Moving up slightly to Far Cry 3, as featured in our last budget build, this time at 1600 by 900. No anti-aliasing, we get ourselves an average 55 FPS. The now 12-year-old GTA 5 gets a score of 52 in the standard benchmark with the same settings. And if you care, Cinebench R24 returns a CPU score of 186 points. So a few items worth mentioning are you could definitely build something better than this, but it takes luck in what you acquire in the first place. I've found it's quite easy to get very cheap or often free desktop PCs locally, but they are nearly always a slim tower, as that's what people most commonly buy, being more compact and generally cheaper when new, in the UK at least. With these you of course have to consider your power supply limits and the thermal limits of the case. As you can see, this one has no provision for a case fan. Not that you couldn't add one yourself with some creative angle grinding and cutting. If you can get a full width case, even if it's just micro ATX, then your quid's in, as you have far more power supply and cheaper graphics card options. This also isn't the best balanced system, but that will depend on what parts are available to you when you try to do something like this. For example, if I was to do this again, I'd probably use half the RAM, possibly a slightly cheaper motherboard, and if unlike me you didn't have to actually buy a stock heatsink, because nothing I have would realistically suit this price bracket, all of this would add up to a slightly better balanced budget, allowing you to get something like a slim GTX 750. This and the slightly more expensive 1050 generally are the best cards you can get for these slim towers. Last thing to note is, of course, these sorts of systems only technically support Windows 10, the support of which does end in a few months. But let's be honest, how many people are going to throw away all this stuff and just buy a new PC? I know I won't be. So I guess that's that, or at least until I get given more random e-waste to make a video with. And no, I don't have Discord. Thanks for watching, and bye bye.